Welcome to the Salinas Vineyard Friday night Sermon of the Week by Pastor Dave Dove.
Thank you, Jesus. Wow. So, the title of the message is Promised Land, and we've been talking about this for a couple of weeks. We started, as we all do, we start in slavery, right, in Egypt, and we cross the Red Sea into the Promised Land, right? Right? We cross the Red Sea into the Promised Land. No, we have to spend time in the wilderness first. So I want to remind you, as I did last week, that there are lessons that need to be learned in the wilderness before we're ready to go into the Promised Land. Does anybody remember any of those lessons that we need to learn in the wilderness on the way to the Promised Land?
Obedience, trust, and gratitude.
Oh my gosh, she got all three. Woo! Obedience, trust, and gratitude. Obedience, trust, and gratitude. So I reminded you last week that, and I'll remind you again this week, is that when we give, it is a sign of all three of those. When we give, it is in obedience to God's exhortation that we should give, and because as we give, now it is given back to us, right? So it starts out in obedience, and I shared this before when Renee and I started this journey together as a family. We didn't know much, but what we did know is that we needed to give to God off the top. Before taxes, before anybody had their hand in the till. Of course, prior to that, and what is common, I think, is we wait to see what we have left over at the end of the month, and then we decide if we've got any left to give generously. Well, we chose to give 10% off of the top. We have been faithful to do that now for 37 years. And God has never failed us. And you know, we give out of obedience, but we also give out of trust, because sometimes it doesn't make any logical sense to give your money away, especially when we were first married. We had zero margin. I was making $1,000 a month. We were paying $600 a month in rent. And we had $400 a month to cover everything else. It's crazy. But we gave because God said to give. So we were trusting in Him, and He has never, ever let us down. We give out of gratitude, out of thanksgiving, because really, as we know, that everybody in this room is in the 1% in the world. I don't care how much money you're making. Even if you're just getting Social Security or welfare checks, whatever you're getting, you are in the top 1% of earners in the world. And I'm always reminded, actually, one of my friends who leads one of the volunteer programs down at CTF, he got a check the other day from a young man that is in one of our classes down there for $100 donation to his church. And you know what the hourly wage is at CTF? It's between 17 and 35 cents an hour, depending on your skills. That's faith. That's faith to do that. So I just want to remind you, we don't pass the baskets. They're up here. I want to just exhort you to be obedient, be grateful, and trust that God has everything under control. So Moses, my servant, is dead. So starts, I think, one of my favorite books among a whole bunch, like 66 other books, but I love the book of Joshua because it talks about leaving the wilderness, because I don't know about you, but I don't want to stay in the wilderness any longer than I have to. You know, the problem is if you spend too much time in the wilderness, Egypt starts looking pretty good. And our tendency is, if we don't cross over into the promised land, we may end up returning back to slavery. Because in the wilderness, it almost kind of feels like you're a slave. You've got some freedom. You're not making bricks anymore. But you're still not in that land that is filled with milk and honey that was promised, right? So you're kind of in this in-between place. It's like, I heard somebody say that, God closes one door and opens another, but it's hell in the hallway. Getting between one and the other. Well, that was like this wilderness journey. They had set out through the wilderness, and they were working their way to the promised land. The books in the Bible, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are all about their life, the journey of God's people through the wilderness. The book of Joshua now starts. They're right at the River Jordan. They're on the east side of the River Jordan. They actually had to circle all the way around from where they were in Egypt. They went all the way around the Philistines because God knew better than to take them through land that was occupied by these armies of enemies, because they probably would have gone right back to Egypt. So they took the long way around, but the reality was that until they learned those lessons of the wilderness, they were not going to get into the promised land. And as a matter of fact, we see that this whole generation, anybody that was 20 years or older coming out of Egypt, failed the test ultimately and died in the wilderness. This journey really, if you kind of map it out on the biblical account, it should have taken them about as long as COVID to get from Egypt to the promised land. About between 2 and 2.5 years was the length of time that it would have taken them to go into the promised land, except they failed the test. They failed the test of obedience. They failed the test of gratitude. And they failed the test of trust. And that whole generation, but for two, Caleb and Joshua, perished in the wilderness. So on the spiritual journey, we learn that if you stay in slavery, it leads to death. If you stay in the world, if you never cross over, now, and we're not talking about just physical death, but we're talking about spiritual death as well. You're dead in your sins in slavery. And I talked about this a little bit last week, but it's in the world, when you're living in Egypt, what you think is freedom really leads to increasing levels of bondage. You know, you think out here, woohoo, I can do whatever I want. Whatever feels good, whatever makes me happy, I can do that. But eventually it starts funneling down into a smaller and smaller and smaller place. And, I know from my friends that have spent time in prison, it can end up in a 6 by 8 foot cell with a dangerous roommate. A psychopath for a roommate. That's how narrow it comes down. And the interesting thing is, it's only when the pain of staying in slavery is greater than the pain of going into the wilderness that we change. Have you noticed? I was at a point in my life when I decided that it wasn't worth anything. Now I'm ready to say, okay, Lord, I'm ready. I'm ready to go into the wilderness. And we see this in the story of the Israelites in Egypt. It got narrower and narrower. And when they first came into Egypt, they were like heroes. They were Joseph's kin. He had saved them from this great famine that was in the land. But I don't think they were supposed to stay in Egypt as long as they did. It was like 400 years. And Pharaoh perished, and Joseph perished, and they forgot who these people were, and they eventually brought them into slavery, and really their goal was to wipe them out because they were fearful of the Israelites, and they were trying to wipe them out. And things got so narrow because their job was to build bricks. They were building these cities for Pharaoh, these ancient cities, and they were making bricks, and they were hauling them, and they were building these ziggurats and these temples and these buildings in ancient Egypt. And when things started getting tighter and tighter, and Pharaoh said, okay, you need to make more bricks and more bricks and more bricks. And pretty soon he's saying, now you need to make bricks and you need to go find your own straw. So things got narrow, and I think that was God's plan, and it was clearly his plan for my life. He was gracious enough to me to let me go my own way. He never coerced me. He never forced me, but he was always there in the background. I think his grace was on my life even before I said yes to him. But he allowed me to come to a place that was so narrow. It was a law of diminishing returns. The things that satisfied out here no longer satisfied down here. The amount of things that satisfied here were no longer enough, and it's like never enough and never enough. And pretty soon I was making bricks without straw. And I was ready. The pain of staying where I was greater than the pain of deciding to change. And then it's like this wilderness journey is like, you know, it's such a narrow place. And you know what's right at that very narrowest place? Is the cross. It's the cross. And I had to let everything else go. I couldn't take anything through that narrow place. And I went through the cross, and it still felt narrow because now it's like, wow, everything that I desired, everything that I thought I wanted, I had to leave behind in Egypt in order to get into this place. And then the wilderness journey is a narrow place too. It's like, it feels like, oh, you know, and you start thinking about what you had back in Egypt, and, you know, we had meat back there. Now we got the stinking manna. We tried everything in the cookbook to make it taste better. I don't think they had salsa back then. Rigoberto, I don't think they had salsa back then, did they? Probably would have made the manna taste better, but they didn't have any. So, but then the thing about this journey, it starts opening up. And it opens up forever. Forever. This guy, I used to tell kids, you know, it's like the world is like a credit card. You get it all right now. You put down your plastic, I'll load it in your car, you can take it home. I guarantee you won't even enjoy it anymore by the time you paid for it. You get it now, but the interest rates are hell. They keep mounting up. The kingdom of God, on the other hand, is like a savings account. I wish, you know, 50 years ago, 55 years ago, somebody had helped me understand a chart of compound interest. Because seriously, if I had put like $1 a week out of my allowance into a savings account that was earning interest, I would be a free man financially today. There's no doubt about it. I had to learn these things the hard way. We were all born into slavery. And I think about this journey, and I think about people in slavery. I've been listening to this guy, Jordan Peterson. He has these podcasts. He was a psychologist and just a really smart guy. I think he's a believer based on some of the things that I've heard him say. But he was talking about this world that we live in, and it's a dangerous, mean place. It's a dangerous, mean world that we live in. And he was describing people that he encounters in the world, and I've run into them not only in the prison but in our streets. And he said there is a malignant contempt. Do you know what that looks like? Malignant contempt. When you pull up next to somebody and just look over like you're going to say hey, and you get the look. Malignant contempt. And it's like, don't even think about it. And it's like you feel like you're so far beneath those people that you just want to disappear because they're dangerous. And this is the thing. In the world, they have no hope. And they have nothing to hope for, and they have nothing to lose. That makes a dangerous person. Our world is filled right now with people who have no hope, and they have nothing to lose. Wow. They're capable of doing anything. They're capable of doing anything. I believe we're witnessing a tragedy of living in a world of slavery, dangerous men and women who have no hope and nothing to lose. But this wilderness journey is a necessary prerequisite to entering the promised land. I think of it analogous to going from infancy, when you're a baby. It's kind of like you're a slave, It's like you go where you're told to go. It's this magical moment as a parent when before your child can crawl or wriggle across the floor, and you can actually put them down and turn away for a minute and come back, and they're still in the same place. So it doesn't last very long, but they are totally dependent on us to meet all of their needs. And I think of the wilderness journey. It's like coming into adolescence, and now, if you remember raising your kids or you remember your own childhood, you start getting a little more freedom and you're kind of testing the waters a little bit, but you still, come home for dinner and you got a place to live and you don't have to work to earn your keep. But it's a time of training, and it's almost like we have the training wheels on. And we're learning how to ride, but assisted. It's tragic that so many people grow up without that kind of support, having to become adults before they're ready. It doesn't end well because they don't learn the things that they need to learn along the way. They are forced to become adult in their responsibilities. And we talk about children who are parentized, who, they're 8 and 9 years old, 10, 11, and they're already watching younger siblings and having to make sure that they get something to eat, and it's, ends up being a bowl of cereal or something. But they're prematurely, and they never get the opportunity to grow into a promised land human being. I think about entering the promised land. It's like now becoming an adult and the training wheels come off. If you've learned the lesson, right? If you've learned the lessons in the wilderness. Now, and we all know this, and I think it's really sad. It saddens me to see how many people are biologically adults, but they're still living like adolescents. And they're expecting somebody to take care of them. And you hear it in the language of victimhood. You hear it in the language of dependence. You hear that. And it's like, no, it's time to cross over. It's time to move into the promised land. We need to deal with this poverty mentality of living in the wilderness for too long. We see it in the Israelites in Exodus chapter 16, verse 20, when manna first happens. And God said, hey, I'm going to take care of you. You can trust me. Every day I'm going to have enough for you to eat. This manna is going to appear on the ground, and it's going to be enough. And it's enough for your daily needs. And tomorrow there's going to be enough for your daily needs. So what's the first thing they do? And he said, don't store it up for the next day. Trust me. This is one of the lessons that he was trying to teach them. It's like, no, manna today, manna tomorrow, manna the day after. You don't have to stress about this. We've got it handled. And what's the first thing they do? Some people start hoarding it, and it starts getting wormy overnight and stinking. And God says, see, you're not supposed to do that. We also learn in the wilderness that we have to face our fears in this really interesting story in Exodus. I'm sorry, it's not Exodus. It's somebody corrected me, Gemma. It's Numbers 21. The story of the serpent on the pole, where they're in the wilderness and there are these fiery serpents, and I've even read where they think they know what kind of snake it is. It's like one of the most venomous snakes, and there were like thousands of them in a certain part of this part of the world. And so there were these fiery serpents that were coming and biting the Israelites, and they were dying as a result of these venomous bites. And so God has Moses put a bronze serpent on top of a pole, and he said when people look at the bronze serpent, when they've been bitten by the snake, they'll be healed. And of course we know it's a type and a shadow of Jesus and the healing that he brings. But isn't it interesting that it was a snake on the pole that they were supposed to look at? How weird is that? And I heard a commentator say that that's because they needed to face their fears. What were they afraid of? Snakes. And snakes represent like this irrational fear. There is like snakeophobia that is very common among people. It's normal to be afraid of snakes. Except for Michelle. She's not afraid of nothing. So they had to learn to face their fears. You know, we help people in this prayer ministry that we do called Sozo Prayer. And sometimes people are fearful because they're afraid to face their past, the pain and the fears that they experienced. And the lie in that is that they don't live with that fear and that pain every day of their lives anyway. It's like not more difficult than it is slogging it out day after day after day without ever facing your fears and allowing God to come in and restore and to heal. They had to learn to stop whining and complaining in the wilderness. If you read this account of the wilderness journey, it's like they were just like, me, all the time, whining and complaining about what they didn't have. Manna again? At least in Egypt we had meat. We're thirsty. Where's the water? I mean, you could just hear this constant whining and complaining. And I love what Bill Johnson says about this. He says, complaining is the language of unbelief. Complaining is the language of unbelief. He also went on to say, God occupies our praises, right? Yes. We know that from the Bible, Psalm 100 and all throughout. God inhabits the praises of his people. Who inhabits your complaining? In the wilderness, we're surviving but not thriving. You know, it's like it's such a tragedy in our nation that we have created this system that keeps people in the wilderness. Give people just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. And if they ever dare to step out from underneath that covering, now we're gonna put them under our boot. You know, we're gonna take away all of the benefits that they need to live, right? You know, if you're in housing that's provided or subsidized, if you are getting they used to call them food stamps. They're not food stamps anymore, but you know, if you're living on that, and you decide, no, I'm done living in the wilderness, I'm going into the promised land, well, now they're going to take all that away, you know, and make it not worth your while to take that next step. So we've created this culture of people just slogging it out in the wilderness, and you just get this. There's not only a poverty mentality, but an entitlement mentality. It's like you don't really learn how to ever take care of yourself. It's like you're kept as little children. I'll never forget, in one of these election cycles, and somebody said, if you're elected president, you'll be our father and we'll be your children. What are you going to do for us? And I thought, it's like, oh my gosh, we are in for some serious rough riding going through with that kind of an attitude. Another little picture of that was after the LA riots. I'm dating myself. It was years and years ago. And the day the riots stopped and the banks opened was the first day of the month. And so, of course, people were queuing up at the bank. And they were interviewing people in line and just see how they were doing. And this one lady says, you know, we're waiting in line and it's hot and I'm thirsty and nobody's bringing us no sodas or nothing. And I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, this is a terrible thing that we've done. We've created that. That's what we've created. Those who fail to learn the wilderness lessons die in the wilderness. Just as simple as that. You know, we see the story in Deuteronomy, Numbers. I think it starts in Numbers. There were three tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. When they came to the edge of the promised land, they said, you know what? The land on the east side of the Jordan looks pretty good. We've got a lot of cattle. We've got a lot of sheep. There's good grazing lands over here. We are choosing not to go into the promised land. If you will give us this for our inheritance on the wilderness side of the promised land, they were happy with that. And I read one commentator that said they were more concerned about their livestock than they were their children. They were more concerned about carving out a comfortable life here than they were about the legacy that God had for them in the promised land. And we see in the case of these three tribes that the Assyrian army came through sometime after that, swept them away into exile, and they were never heard from again. And that's a picture of, and hear me on this, if you're in the wilderness, it means you've already come through the Red Sea. You've already been saved, but you're still not entering into the promised land. And there are so many wilderness Christians. There are a vast number more wilderness Christians than there are promised land Christians. Because what do? We make ourselves comfortable. We are worried about having grazing land for our sheep and our cattle and our goats. And we are not concerned with the destiny that God has planned for us in the promised land. So we just get comfortable in the wilderness. We make the best of it. We never fulfill the calling, the upward calling of God on our lives. So I want you to stand with me by the River Jordan. And sometimes I feel like I haven't gone across, you know? It's like sometimes I feel like, or maybe I've gone across and then I've come back. I don't know. You know, it's like I'm not pointing the finger at anybody. I think this is more common probably in the American church than it is in countries that don't have such a comfortable lifestyle that we do. It's like we can get really comfortable, you know, with what we have and what we can earn and what we can purchase. And it's like a, you know, if you're going to stay in the wilderness, you might as well get drugged up, you know, with easy living, you know, with comfort and pleasure and entertainment. You know, you could, and we've all been there, you know, you could, there is so much good stuff on cable TV, and it's not bad stuff. I mean, I was binge watching like documentaries, you know, when I had my little surgery, and it's not like a bad thing, but it's like, wow, you can like lose like a whole day. Not to mention all the marginally bad stuff, you know, that just, it's like junk food. Let me put it that way. God has a meal for us, but we satisfy ourselves with low nutritional, high calorie food that's going to make us happy and fat. Right? So the first 5 chapters of the book of Joshua is where I'm landing tonight, talking about this entry into the promised land. Just as everything changes when we leave slavery and we go into the wilderness, everything changes again on the journey to the promised land. I want to talk to you tonight, and it's going to go faster than you think. 7 principles of promised land living. 7 principles of promised land living. Number 1, Moses no longer leads the people. Now the presence leads the people. Joshua chapter 3 verse 15 says this. They came up, let me set the scene. So they came up, it was time to cross over, and they come up to the Jordan River. And it's not just like the Salinas River most times, where there's a little trickle of water going through. It's like you roll up your pants legs and you walk through. It was the Jordan River at flood stage. So imagine that. I've only seen the Salinas River at flood stage once in the last 11 or 12 years. And I've seen pictures of it at above flood stage. So this is no insignificant thing. But imagine standing there and the waters are like roiling past, and you can barely even see the other side because it's in flood. And God tells Joshua to have the men carrying the Ark of the Covenant that represents the presence of God up to the edge and step into the Jordan River at flood stage. Now think of the courage that took. Think of the trust and the obedience that was required for them to do that. And they're carrying this box that probably weighed several hundred pounds or more on their shoulders, and they're going to step into this roiling flood that is roaring past, and they are obedient, and they step into the flood water, and it separates. Now, these people didn't even witness this happening at the Red Sea because all those people are gone, but they heard the stories. They heard the stories. And they stepped in, but it wasn't Moses striking the water with his staff anymore. It was now the presence of God that was making a way for them to go from the wilderness into the promised land. It says in Joshua 3:15, and as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of the harvest, and the waters separated. Have any priests in here? Yeah. You know, what happens, the first thing they notice when they get into the promised land, no more pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night, that when it moved, you moved, when it stopped, you stopped, like good little ducklings following mama, right? When the cloud or the fire moves, they would move. When it would stop, they stop. It goes away. It doesn't go into the promised land with them. Those are the training wheels. Now the presence of God is carried on human legs. The presence of God is now carried by the priests. Hello, priests. The presence of God is now carried by the priests literally on human legs. We carry the presence. Number 2, principle of promised land living. It takes courage, you guys. It takes courage. You know, in the Bible, 103 times in the Bible, God exhorts us in one form or another, don't be afraid. Why does he have to say it so often? Because we're stinking afraid. We're a fearful people. You know, I used to think that courage was not having fear. That's not true. Courage is moving forward even though you're afraid. That's courage. It's not courage. These rare individuals that are fearless, they're not courageous, they're just fearless. And they will walk into a hail of gunfire, or they, do crazy things, crazy exploits. But courage is for us cowards who are afraid, but we move forward. We say, I'm afraid, but I'll trust you anyway, right? And I'll be obedient to what you're calling me to do. In Deuteronomy 31:6, Lord is talking to, or this is Moses talking to Joshua, and he says, "Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, He is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you." And in the first chapter of Joshua, 3 times in the very first chapter, God tells Joshua, don't be afraid. Be of good courage. Why did he have to tell him 3 times? Because Joshua was afraid to go into the promised land. Third principle of promised land living, or this transition, when they cross over the river Jordan, God tells them to pick a man from each tribe and pick up a stone from the dry riverbed as they're crossing over and bring it over and make a memorial. And it is a memorial of remembrance. And so that when your children ask you, what's that pile of stones over there? You say, that's so we remember. Let me tell you what God did for us that day. In the promised land, we need, that's our testimony. It's a weapon that we use in the promised land. We have to remind ourselves of what God did for us in the past, so it'll give us courage to move forward into where He hasn't yet moved in our lives. Our testimony of giving is to encourage us to continue giving. Even in the face of 37 years, He's never let us down yet. I guess I don't know, maybe He'll let me down tomorrow. No, probably not. And in Revelations, incidentally, it says, when it's talking about this great cosmic battle between Satan and the angels, between the fallen angels and God's angels, and it says they were defeated, and it says they were defeated by the word of their testimony and by the blood of the Lamb. The word of their testimony and the blood of the Lamb. That's your story. That's my story, and it's God's story. And they come together right around our testimony, right? My story and God's story become intertwined. And it becomes a weapon that I can use to bring Satan down. As a matter of fact, it's the only weapon I have. I had a friend of mine come to town, and he was preaching, and I went to hear him preach, and he has a remarkable testimony. And he got done teaching, and he asked me, and I said, you want some feedback? And he said, yes. And I said, bro, you left your weapon behind you. He didn't share his story. It was a remarkable testimony. He taught a great message, a great lesson, but he left his weapon behind. There may have been somebody there that needed that weapon to see them set free, because my testimony can be your prophecy. We know that. My testimony, what God did for me, He will do for you. And as I share the story of what God has done for me, you can grab hold of that and say, and maybe it'll ratchet up your faith a little. Well, if He did it for Him, certainly He'll do it for me. And that's absolutely true. If He did it for me, He will do it for you. Never forget the testimony of what God has done. It will allow you to move forward into the promised land, even when you're afraid. Number 4, be prepared to pay the price of promised land living. There's a cost to going into the promised land. Retirement. Retirement for me means being tired again. That's it. We have been after the Lord our whole marriage. Are you trying to get my attention? Am I off the map?
No.
It's okay. If you're trying to fill in the notes, don't. You can talk to me later. Be prepared to pay the price of promised land living. Joshua 5, verses 2 and 3. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives for yourselves and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time. So Joshua made flint knives for himself and circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. In Hebrew, that's called ow. Never mind. Number 5, principle of promised land living. You must learn to feed yourself in the promised land. You have to learn to feed yourself in the promised land. Manna disappears as soon as you cross the River Jordan. Sorry about that. Joshua 5:12 says, manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land, and the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year. Manna's gone. Now you're in a world where you shoot it, you eat it. Right, Michelle? Yes. Ooh. You shoot it, you eat it. They have to find their own meat. You know, it says in Numbers 14:9, when these spies go into the land and they come back with an evil report, it's because they say, there's giants in the land. We were like little ants compared to the giants. And Joshua and Caleb say this. They say, don't rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our food. A little giant sandwich, go into the promised land. Some translations say bread, but it can also be interpreted food or even meat. So the giants, the enemies in the land, will be our meat. Do not fear them. I think about John Wimber, who founded the Vineyard movement, and he used to say, because people would come up, and I've heard it too, it's like, Pastor, why are you still giving us milk? When are you going to give us the meat? Right? It's like the little old lady in the old Wendy's commercials, where's the meat? Right? Wow, 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 wow. Aren't you going to feed me? It's like little baby birds sometimes. It's like, cheep, 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 cheep. Aren't you going to feed me? Aren't you going to feed me? John Wimber said, no, the meat's in the streets. There's no meat here. The meat's in the streets. I think about John chapter 4 with Jesus and the woman at the well. And his friends all go to get food, right? They go into town to buy food, and Jesus is there, and he has this remarkable interaction with this woman at the well. And his friends come back and want to give him food, and he's going, no, I'm full. What did you eat, Jesus? He said, I have food, I have meat of which you know not. Because his meat was to do the will of the Father. I'm trying. The 6th principle of promised land living. In the promised land, we come into a different kind of relationship with God. We come into a different kind of relationship with God. In the wilderness, we know God as our Savior. In the promised land, we now know him as our Lord. And now he's not going to fight our battles for us. He wants us to partner with him to take the land, to see the kingdom advanced. I love this scene. Joshua, they've crossed over. It's right before they get to Jericho. And I'm sure that Joshua is out like finding a quiet place to pray. And I'm sure his prayer was like, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. Help. because he's getting ready to go up against this fortified city, the first major battle in the promised land. And he goes out, and it said, it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite to him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and said to him, are you for us, or are you for our adversaries? And the man looks at him and says, no. I'm sure Joshua was like, that wasn't the question I was asking. Are you hard of hearing? I'm saying, are you for us or are you for our enemies? And listen to what this being says. He says, no, but as the commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? Amen. So good. You see, we're no longer children looking to God to meet all of our needs. Now it's like, Lord, what do you want me to do to meet your needs? It flips. It flips in the promised land. And you notice that this was actually God himself, and people, scholars believe that it was a pre-incarnational vision of Jesus himself that came to Joshua in that moment, because in every other place in the Bible, if somebody tries to worship an angel, the angel picks them up and says, oh no, don't do that. This being the captain of the hosts received Joshua's worship. It was God himself. And he said, Lord, what does my Lord say to his servant? Everything starts flipping. Everything starts flipping. I love what Chris Valentin said a couple of weeks ago. He said, we are saved when we believe in him. We are transformed when he believes in us. Not a good word. We're saved when we believe in him. We're transformed when we discover that he believes in us. Mighty men and women of God. Are you ready to enter the promised land?
Yes.
Anybody? Scary. I watched this, one of these documentaries I watched, and I promise you I'm going to close here in a little bit, was on Netflix, and I would recommend it. It's called 14 Peaks, Nothing is Impossible. 14 peaks, nothing is impossible. There are 14 mountain peaks in the world that are over 8,000 meters. Now listen to me, that's 26,240 feet is 800 meters. There are 14 peaks that are higher than 800 meters tall. The world record for climbing all 14 was by a Korean climber named Kim Chang-ho, and this record-setting time, it took him 7 years to climb all 14 peaks. Unheard of. People, they didn't know that it was possible to do 2 of these peaks a year and keep up that pace. That was in 2013. In 2019, this man by the name of Nims Pura, he was a Nepalese man. He had been part of climbing expeditions all his life. He was a Sherpa. He was also a Gurkha. He was in the special forces in the British military. Pretty amazing guy. He started sharing his dream with others that he was going to climb all 14 of those peaks in the same year. In the same year. And as he recounts it, when he shared his dream with others, they all told him that it was impossible. So he says, I decided to call my expedition Project Possible. That's promised land thinking. That's promised land thinking. April 23rd, 2019, Nims and his team, who were also some of his Sherpa buddies, scaled the first peak, Annapurna, 26,545 feet in Nepal. This mountain was so hard to climb that out of every 3 people that successfully make the summit, 1 person dies. That's like, I don't like them odds at all. 6 months and 6 days later, Pura climbed peak number 14. The impossible had become possible. The impossible had become possible. Don't let anyone tell you that your dream is impossible. Matthew 19:26, Jesus says, with God, all things are possible. So finally, the 7th principle of promised land living. If you can't see it, you can't possess it. If you can't see it, you can't possess it. There's a man by the name of David Cook. He wrote a little book called Greatness. I heard Chris Valentin share about it. I was working on this message already. It just fit right in. He said that Bill Johnson had given him this little book. He said he said, I read it because it's really small, and that was a good thing. And he said, and it was talking about how to accomplish great things. This man was brought in. You know how these professional athletes, it's like they'll get into a slump. Like they're first class, they're amazing athletes. They have these amazing accomplishments, and all of a sudden they can't make a free throw. They're in a slump. And this man was a sports psychologist, and he would come in and help them overcome their slump. So Chris said he was reading this book, and he's going, well, why am I reading this? And it gets to the very end of the book, and it says that the last chapter of this book is sealed. And if you open it and read it, you will be offended, I guarantee you. And so, of course, Chris opens it. You know, it was like sealed with a little seal over it. And he says, the first thing he says is, I'm a Christian. And everything that I have taught you in this book comes right out of the Bible. And he shares his testimony. So what did he teach? He says this is what he would do with athletes in a slump. He said, first of all, you need to visualize it clearly. Somebody that can't hit a free throw, you need to visualize yourself making the free throw over and over and over again. Visualize it, be able to see it, be able to describe it, be able to look at it in your mind's eye. Number 2, you need to rehearse it. You need to play it over in your mind so it just becomes second nature. I saw this just after, actually I watched just a minute of the Olympics, and I was watching these downhill skiers, and I was watching this woman. This was before I heard this story, and it just immediately connected with that. She was on deck. She's ready to go down, and she's in a crouch like this, and she's got her eyes closed, and she's doing this. She's going down the run before she goes down the run. She's rehearsing it in her mind. So what's your dream? Can you see it, and can you imagine in your mind that you're accomplishing it? And finally, he said, you must believe that you can do it. Those are the 3 ingredients. You got to be able to see it, you got to be able to rehearse it in your mind, and then you need to believe that it in fact is possible, even in spite of everybody telling you that it's not. So finally, those are the 7 principles of promised land living. But they come with a promise. 2 promises from God. Joshua chapter 1, verse 3. God says this to Joshua. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you. You need to know that. When you're walking into the promised land, everywhere your foot treads God is giving you that territory. It's already done. It's already written in the book. It's already been accomplished. We just get to walk it out. Second promise. God says, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you. I will not forsake you. Wow.